I used to take the subway late at night when I worked the night shift as a janitor for an office building in Manhattan. The pay was decent, but the hours were brutal. My shift ended at 2 a.m., and I'd always catch the last train heading toward Queens. The ride home was usually uneventful. Quiet cars, with a few exhausted passengers all keeping to themselves. One night in late November, it was unusually cold, and the streets were nearly empty. When I got to the Times Square station, the platform was almost deserted, except for a man in a dark hoodie sitting on a bench. I swiped my Metro card and waited for the train, glancing at the man a few times. He was sitting completely still, his hood up, face turned slightly away. Something about him felt off, but I brushed it aside. When the train arrived, I stepped into one of the cars and sat near the middle, putting my bag on the seat next to me. To my relief, it was mostly empty, except for one or two passengers spread out. As the doors closed, I noticed the man from the platform had boarded the same car and was sitting at the very back, hood still up. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just going home like everyone else. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling, trying to stay awake, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced at the windows across from me, using the reflection to get a better view. The man was staring directly at me. I quickly looked down at my phone, pretending I hadn't noticed. Maybe I was imagining things, but when the train screeched to a stop at Grand Central, I felt a shift. The few other passengers got off, and now it was just the two of us in the car. I told myself to relax. This was New York. People acted strange all the time. The train started moving again, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw him get up. My stomach tightened as he moved closer, taking a seat a few rows behind me. I gripped my bag tightly, pretending to still be absorbed in my phone. Every time I glanced at the window reflection, he was there, sitting stiffly, watching. By the time we reached Roosevelt Island, I had made up my mind to get off and wait for another train. As the train slowed, I stood up, slinging my bag over my shoulder. I headed toward the nearest door, but just before I stepped out, I glanced back. He had risen from his seat and was moving toward me. I panicked and stayed on the train, letting the doors close again. My heart was pounding. I moved to the far end of the car, putting as much distance as I could between us. When I looked back, he had stopped walking and was now standing in the middle of the car, facing me. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, keeping my voice low as I explained the situation. The operator told me to stay calm and get off at the next station, where they would have officers waiting for me. The train screeched into Queensboro Plaza, and I bolted out the doors as soon as they opened. My legs were shaking as I stepped onto the platform. Sure enough, 2 NYPD officers were waiting at the top of the stairs. I pointed to the car where the man was, but when they checked, it was empty. He must have slipped off just before I did. The officers escorted me to the street level and offered to take me home, but I declined. I ended up calling a rideshare and spent the rest of the ride scanning the streets, half expecting to see him again. To this day, I don't know what he wanted or why he followed me, but I've never taken the subway late at night again. That was the night I learned that in New York, it's not just the city that never sleeps. You have to stay vigilant too. I had been obsessed with the idea of train hopping ever since I stumbled across a YouTube channel documenting the lifestyle. Something about the freedom and adventure called to me. It wasn't something I'd ever tell my parents about. They'd kill me if they knew. But I figured one quick ride wouldn't hurt. My plan was simple. Hop a train at the edge of Springfield, Illinois, ride it for an hour or so, Then jump off before it left town. Easy. It was a cool evening in early October, just past 9 p.m. I rode my bike to the freight yard on the outskirts of town. From what I'd read online, the key was to keep a low profile and wait for a train to slow down. Luckily, it didn't take long. About 20 minutes after I arrived, a long intermodal freight train crawled into the yard. Most of the boxcars were locked up tight, but I spotted one of the large double-stack well cars, with space to hide between the containers. Heart pounding, I ditched my bike in the tall grass and jogged alongside the train until I found my spot. With one last glance around to make sure no one was watching, I pulled myself up and into the car. The hum of the train vibrated through my hands as I settled into the cramped corner, hidden from view. This was it. I was finally doing it. I was a real train hopper. At first, the ride was exhilarating. The train rolled through the city, the familiar streets and lights zipping past. I kept telling myself I'd jump off as soon as we reached the edge of town. But as the train picked up speed, I realized I had no idea how to do that safely. It was moving too fast for me to jump without breaking something. Panic set in. I told myself the train would stop again soon. It had to, right? Freight trains don't go on forever. But as the minutes ticked by, the city faded into the distance, replaced by dark fields and thick forests. The occasional farmhouse light flickered in the distance, but there was nothing else out here. I was trapped. After what felt like hours, the train finally began to slow. I held my breath as it screeched to a halt, and I climbed out of the well car, my legs stiff and shaky. My heart sank when I looked around. There were no towns, no roads, just trees in every direction. The train had stopped in the middle of nowhere. I debated staying on the train, but the thought of it speeding off again made my stomach churn. Instead, I decided to follow the tracks, figuring they'd eventually lead me to a road or town. I pulled out my phone for directions, only to find I had no signal. The forest was eerily quiet as I started walking. The crunch of gravel under my boots was the only sound, and the dark seemed to close in around me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone or something to be following me. I told myself I was just being paranoid. About a mile down the tracks, I saw a faint orange glow flickering through the trees. At first, I thought it might be a campsite or a house, and I felt a wave of relief. But as I got closer, I realized it was a small fire, and around it sat 3 people. Their silhouettes were just visible in the firelight, and something about them felt off. I stopped in my tracks, staying hidden behind the trees. One of them was holding something that glinted in the firelight, maybe a knife or a piece of metal. They were talking in low voices, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I didn't want to stick around to find out. As quietly as I could, I backed away and started walking down the tracks again, faster this time. I'd only gone a few steps when I heard one of them shout, "Hey, you out there?" My blood turned to ice. I didn't answer, hoping they hadn't seen me. But then I heard footsteps on the gravel, coming toward me. I ran. My boots pounded against the ground as I sprinted down the tracks, the footsteps behind me getting louder. I didn't dare look back. The panic turned to terror as I realized they were shouting at each other, coordinating. They weren't just chasing me, they were hunting me. Up ahead, I spotted a dense patch of trees near the tracks. Without thinking, I darted into the woods, hoping to lose them in the thick brush. The branches scratched at my face and arms as I stumbled through, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I crouched behind a tree, listening as the footsteps grew closer. "Where'd he go?" one of them growled, his voice rough and angry. Spread out, another one barked. He couldn't have gotten far. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The sound of their footsteps and the rustling of leaves filled my ears as they searched the woods. Then, just when I thought they were moving away, a beam of light from a flashlight swept past the tree I was hiding behind. My heart felt like it would explode. I had to move. As soon as the light passed, I bolted, weaving through the trees as quietly as I could. I could still hear them behind me, their voices echoing through the forest. It felt like I was running forever, but eventually, the sounds began to fade. I didn't stop until I stumbled onto a narrow dirt road. I leaned against a tree, trying to catch my breath, when I heard the distant sound of an engine. At first, I thought it might be one of them, but as the headlights came into view, I realized it was a pickup truck. I stepped into the road, waving my arms frantically, and the truck slowed to a stop. The driver, an older man in a flannel shirt, looked at me with concern. "You okay, son?" he asked. I quickly explained that I'd gotten lost while hiking, leaving out the part about the train and the men chasing me. He nodded and offered me a ride back to town. As we drove away, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those men emerge from the woods. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I'll never forget the sound of their footsteps chasing me through the dark. And I'll never hop another train again. I've been a freight train conductor for a little over 15 years. And if there's one thing you learn in this job, it's that the rails have stories of their own. Most of them are harmless, quirky tales about old conductors or odd cargo. But there's one stretch of track outside Barstow, California, that I'll never forget, because it made me question everything I thought I knew about this job. It started on a quiet night in December 2013. My engineer, Mike, and I were hauling a freight train loaded with construction materials across the desert. The run was supposed to take about 6 hours, mostly through empty terrain. Nothing unusual. We'd done it countless times before. It was close to 2 a.m. when we first saw her. Mike and I were chatting idly when the headlights illuminated a figure standing dead center on the tracks ahead. A woman, wearing a pale dress that fluttered in the desert breeze. She was just standing there, staring right at us. Mike hit the horn immediately. "Get off the tracks," he shouted, as if she could hear him. I sat frozen in my seat, my pulse racing as the train barreled closer. But she didn't move, not an inch. When it became clear she wasn't going to step aside, Mike slammed on the emergency brake. The sound of the screeching metal was deafening, and I braced for impact. But just as the train was about to hit her, she disappeared. I mean, vanished. No jump to the side, no running into the night. 1 second she was there, the next she wasn't. Mike and I looked at each other, shaken but determined to figure out what had just happened. He brought the train to a stop, and we climbed out with our flashlights, scouring the area where we'd seen her. But there was nothing. No tracks in the gravel, no sign anyone had been there. "Maybe it was an animal," Mike said, his voice uncertain. I didn't believe that for a second, but what else could we say? We got back in the cab and continued the run, chalking it up to exhaustion. But then, it happened again. About an hour later, just as we were getting back into a rhythm, she appeared on the tracks ahead of us. Same pale dress, same unflinching stare. My stomach sank as Mike hit the horn again, this time with a little more panic in his voice. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, his hands gripping the controls. Once again, she stood still until we were nearly on top of her, and once again, she vanished. This time, we didn't stop. We didn't get out to look. What was the point? It was impossible. And yet, it was happening. By the third time we saw her, Mike was visibly shaken. He refused to say her name, refused to acknowledge her as anything more than that thing. I wasn't doing much better, my hands trembling every time I reached for the radio. We were halfway through the stretch of track, and I prayed we wouldn't see her again. But we did. The fourth time, she was closer than before, her expression blank, but somehow accusing. I swear, her eyes followed us even as she faded into nothing. When we finally reached the yard in Barstow, Mike didn't say a word as he shut down the engine. I tried to bring it up, but he waved me off, muttering something about not feeding into it. I couldn't let it go, though. Over the next few days, I did some digging. I didn't tell anyone else what we'd seen. Who would believe me? But I scoured local news archives and railroad records. That's when I found it, an article from 1987 about a woman who had thrown herself in front of a train on that exact stretch of track. Her name was Margaret Hollis. She'd been in her mid-30s, struggling with depression after losing her husband in a car accident. According to the article, multiple conductors had reported seeing a woman matching her description on the tracks late at night. But the strange part? No one had ever hit her. She would always disappear before the train made contact. I brought it up to a few of the older guys at the yard, and they just gave me knowing looks. "You ran the Barstow route, didn't you?" one of them said with a smirk. "We call her Maggie. Don't worry, she won't hurt you. She just likes to be remembered." I've run that route a few times since then, but only during the day. I can't bring myself to take a night shift on those tracks anymore. Whether it's Margaret Hollis or something else entirely, I know what I saw. And I know I'm not the only one. The tracks have stories, and some of them are meant to stay buried. But Maggie, she'll make sure you remember her. Thanks so much for listening to Nightmare Narratives. We hope you enjoyed these truly terrifying stories. If you did, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you'll know when we post new videos every Tuesday and Friday at 10 a.m. Central Time. If you have a scary story you'd like to hear read on the channel, email us at officialnightmarenarratives@gmail.com. and you might just hear your story in a future episode. Thanks again for listening, and stay spooky, friends. We'll catch you in the next one.